Hi, everybody. We are here today to talk about automation and AI. Hi, everybody. We are here today with Sam Draushack. He is the founder of Truvle, which is a process improvement firm that specializes in helping services-based companies to automate, scale, and grow. Sam has consulted for mid to enterprise level companies across a wide range of sectors and verticals. He's also a long-standing contributor to The Great IT Professional. We're lucky to have him here today. Sam, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
So, Sam, we're going to get right into this. First of all, when we talk about let's just break this up. When we talk about AI and automation, first of all, when we talk about AI, what actually are we talking about? Can you help us define that or give us a sense of what we mean when we talk about AI?
Sure. And when I talk about these topics, first, like you mentioned, AI and automation are not interchangeable. I think that's the one thing. So when we talk about just AI, we talk about artificial intelligence. I think the way I normally articulate to people is when we talk about intelligence from a process perspective, we're talking about decision making. So when we talk about humans making decisions, they are usually in a scenario where they're observing or they're having inputs given to them and they have to make decisions to decide whether a process goes A or B, just your day-to-day decisions, eggs or bacon, juice or water. So anytime an entity that is non-human is making a decision in a process, that would be using artificial intelligence. So if you equate, again, the intelligence to the ability to make a decision, then when a non-human entity is participating in a process, it could be a robot, it could be software, it could be even an animal, that would be artificial intelligence in a way.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And when we talk in the context of this conversation today, when we're talking about automation, what actually are we talking about? How broad of a category is that?
So automation is extremely broad, and a lot of people it's almost a loaded term these days when we talk about how it's thrown around in business. Everybody wants automation. And it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I'm going to give my professional definition and perspective on automation. And it doesn't even necessarily, again, have anything to do with technology. It's really just the ability to take decision-making and drive it down to a less skilled or experienced resource. And typically that also aligns with a less costly resource. So for instance, the ultimate form of cost-saving automation would be to take something that a human does today and have a robot or technology do it tomorrow, because the idea behind that would be I could pay somebody, let's say $10 an hour to be making decisions. And if I can pay a robot pennies to the dollar and they never sleep and they never eat, that'd be an extremely cost-effective way to drive decision-making down to a lower cost or a lower skilled resource. But that doesn't mean it has to be technology. And I'm making the point that automation could be today an executive makes a really tough decision and tomorrow a junior associate is able to make that decision. The work that goes into making that lower skilled resource make the same decision making possible, that also falls in automation work. And I think that's the part where people don't normally think about automation that way, but that is the nature and spirit of automating processes, which is just driving down the complexity in decision making.
That's great. Nobody's ever pointed that out to me. I've never heard that. And I love that concept because it also sort of implies that there will be jobs that, not all jobs are going to be destroyed by automation. If we're driving them down to lower skilled people, that's actually a boon to the lower skilled, entry level professionals. But when you talk about one of the examples you said was, driving things down to say to a robot, which works 24/7 and doesn't have to eat or sleep. What are we talking about there? Because on one hand, you've got three-dimensional robots, like what you might imagine in industry, but then there's also like software robots. And how do you like RPA, robotic process automation? How do you differentiate between different types of robots when we use that term?
Sure. So robots, again, like you pointed out, RPA, robotic process automation, typically in the services space, that's usually all software robots. So what's done today on a computer screen or what decisions are made within software systems can be automated through robotics. There's a wide span there, and that's where the artificial intelligence, like you said, the different degrees of artificial intelligence come in. So if I could set up in everyone's mind almost a matrix of, you can have a very not complex software robot that has very little artificial intelligence. It's more so just reading cues and just acting automatically. And then you could have extremely complex artificial intelligence that powers a software robot, which is it's reading its environment like a human, taking in cues from the environment, reading complex situations, and then making decisions. And then at the same time, you can have very low complexity AI and very high complexity AI that drives physical robotics. Like you said, robots working in warehouses, robots that are driving cars. So when you think about, and hopefully I'm not getting too off track, but when you tie RPA, if I'm RPA in manufacturing, I'm mostly going to be colloquially referring to physical robots because it's replacing physical processes. If I'm referring to RPA and I'm in a if I'm in a services industry or I'm in a digital services company, that same term is likely going to refer to software, robotics in the form of software. And again, and some people, depending on the complexity of the artificial intelligence powering the robotics, some people have different thresholds for when they say, well, this is just software scripting versus this is an actual robot. And the same thing in physical world, right? Where if I say, is this actual RPA? Am I using a robot? Well, do we consider a swinging gate a robot? Or do we only consider a robot the ones that are complex enough to walk around in the store next to you? And I think that threshold is a little bit muddy. So I know I set up a few different concepts there, but hopefully that helps illuminate the question.
No, I'm delighted that we've invited you to this interview because I'm learning with every question. These are wonderfully you framed these answers very well. What would you say? Could you give us an example or a use case of a complex software robot that has high complexity AI?
Probably. Let me think on it for a second.
Like what would be some, I mean, and we're talking about involving, visual perception, possibly natural language processing. We're talking about the whole gamut. What would be what would be one of the most sophisticated examples that currently being out there for complexity?
Well, I think one of the most recognizable ones would be Alexa, especially if you're looking at integrating natural language processing and the ability to make decisions. So when you think about the range of things that Amazon's Alexa can do, it's reading in a room somebody's interpretation of a command through voice, and then it has to interpret that into an actual command, let's say to order a product, to find music in a database and play it. So that's a complex, I would say, version of a software robot, where this is not a physical entity. This is really just a piece of software that's listening to an environment, taking in that data, and then executing commands. And there has to be a lot of context that's read there. And especially the natural language processing is impressive, especially as Amazon's iterated that product. And then a very low level one would be, let's say today I'm paying an entry level person to fill out government forms. So maybe I send them an Excel sheet and they have to go to a government website and they have to be able to see the screen and look at where to click on fields and to be able to know where that data goes. And a low level software robotic process automation could be a robot that does that. So you're not going to see the robot sitting at the computer, but the robot also takes that same Excel sheet, but maybe through an email, clicks on the government site and does the same thing a human would, navigates the 4 fields, be able to pick one to match, okay, this field would go here, and then move the data over like a human would. And that's much, much simpler than Alexa. But if you think about a simpler software robot, that's still something that a human has to do today, because before a software robot to do that, there wasn't a program that could have to read the screens, be able to click buttons, move things around. So that would be some examples around that continuum.
So if we're with that, keeping in following up on that example of a low level complexity robot that is scraping screens and going in and out and inputting data into different spreadsheets and possibly different websites, would these low level robots also be able to respond intelligently to emails? And do they have the ability to respond to people within the enterprise?
So I think the question of do they have the ability, it really comes down to what they're programmed to do. So a lower level complexity software robot, for instance, it won't have the capability to do anything outside of its parameters that were programmed typically, because low complexity is not employing a high degree of flexible artificial intelligence. It's not any sort of models that is able to take something and learn from its mistakes. Typically low level software automation software robotics is going to be able to take some basic rules, be able to take visual cues, or not even visual because it's just reading data on a screen typically. And when it can't do what it's meant to do, it may run through a little bit of troubleshooting, but then it usually creates an error and then notifies somebody that an error is created. So when you say, can it do it? It certainly can. So if I wanted to expand its scope or its capability to say read emails, screen the data in the emails, and then generate a few responses, it's really just a matter of programming that allows its capability at that low level of artificial intelligence or low level of complexity.
You mentioned that at a higher level of complexities, some of these bots can learn from their mistakes. How exactly is that possible?
Yeah, so that's where you get into the more advanced artificial intelligence programming. And I won't pretend to be an expert in how it's actually coded from a software perspective. But if you think about a low level artificial intelligence saying, do this, and if it does not work, produce error message, there's just layers and layers of programming that could say, do this. And if it doesn't work, instead of doing an error message, there's additional code that sits under that says explore alternative routes. And then you can have additional code that sits under that and says, if alternative route was successful, then rewrite your top level of code to include that in your top level decision making. And hopefully that's a simple enough kind of example of the logic to see that, well, if a software has those layers of programming in it, then actually through exploring and through looking at errors and alternate process paths, it can then actually add new routines to its top level of code through exploration. And if you think about that as a learning, like a simple learning mechanism, then you've got an AI that has more flexibility to, okay, my main objective is blocked. Do I have the requisite programming to explore alternate routes to meet the same objective? And if I am successful, now I know to try that in the future.
But and I don't want to go into too deep territory, but with those alternate routes have to be essentially hard coded algorithmically by the developers. Would they have? Is it because I'll give you an example. When I think about learning from mistakes, when they tell the story about the Go computer, that Google's supercomputer that played the world champion at Go, and that was an example of deep learning. And it beat the world champion at Go, which is a game that is considered infinitely more complex than chess even. And afterwards, nobody was able to figure out how the computer had won. They didn't understand how it developed the strategies, what strategies it employed. It figured the game out on its own. It figured out a strategy to win, and none of it was not. This is not in the old days when Kasparov played IBM's Deep Blue computer. They literally programmed the computer how to play chess, right? And in deep learning, this was a case where it just kind of studied patterns over and over again at rapid speeds for a very long time until it kind of learned on its own. But when you say explore alternative routes, you're not talking about deep learning. You're talking about people actually hard coding this algorithmically. Is that correct?
At this level, yeah, more or less, because what you're hard coding is not these are the alternate routes. It's really hard coding the rules which would define an alternate route and then allowing the program a way to find them.
Okay, so there is some flexibility there on the computer, on the bot's part.
I would say so. There's a lot of different. There's a huge continuum, and I think what people need where I would like to convey about how this type of artificial intelligence is usually managed. You have hard coding can be very much like, okay, pick A or pick B or pick C. And you could hard code the logic in which a robot would do one or the other. You could also say, if not A, a hard coded thing could say, if not A, then explore B, and if not B, then explore C. So this is like a very simple example, but the way you code that will materially change how an artificial intelligence would pick between choices A, B, and C. Now, if you follow that logic and you say, okay, if A does not work, look for something that falls within the parameters of A that could equal an alternate path of B or C. It's similarly hard coded. It's not like like a greater intelligence there that's going to be able to go way outside of its parameters. But this is where a computer then starts materially thinking differently than a human. Because let's say I said A, B, and C are different doors, but to a computer, there's no physiology that binds the way it thinks. So if I say, look for something door-like, that could be the size of a pin. It could be the size of, a micron, something that we can't even see with the naked eye. So it may seem at first glance like the computer is creating new intelligence that a human wouldn't have thought of. It's just the computers are typically, they can process data infinitely faster than we can. When you give them parameters, their creativity is a lot of times often just in they're not constrained by the way that humans think and that humans sense the world. So in a way, until we reach true artificial intelligence or general AI, or there's many terms for it, where the computer is actually in fact self-explorative and discovering things, everything is hard coded to some sense or another. It's just, am I hard coding how it identifies and parses new information, or am I literally hard coding the options and the choices that it can make? And I think that's really what I was trying to differentiate. And maybe that, hopefully that answers where you're going.
Oh, it does. It does very much so. Do you actually believe general AI is going to be achievable in our working lifetimes? I hear different. A lot of what I hear, I think it's just marketing. And so I'm not sure how close we are to that. I mean, even if you take like IBM's Watson, for instance, which is famous for being able to, they use it at the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, and it's what they would call single domain, which means it's excellent in that one domain. But when they had to get Watson to play Jeopardy, they had to completely reconstruct the computer because it's not a general AI machine. It's highly single domain, highly focused and tuned to that one area. So I'm wondering, do you think that this is marketing, or do you think this is actually realistic that we'll see this in our working lifetime?
So I think both, and I'll explain, but I will say now we're moving, I'm definitely moving more from my professional domain to speculative.
That's fine. We just, as long as you put the caveat out there, we're okay with a little speculation now and then.
I am too. I think it's some very fascinating stuff going on. So I'm happy to comment on it. And in my personal opinion, there's a lot of technologists that believe the technological singularity event will occur in our lifetime, and futurists have kind of been aligned that may be the case. And I in my mind, associate the actual legitimate creation of general artificial intelligence with the technological singularity event. And that means that's at which point human history and the human mind won't be able to comprehend what occurs after that. So there's no way for us to predict after that singularity point what that will look like and what that will mean for the human race and just technology and people and everything. So I do not think it's happened yet. So the answer to your first question is, I don't believe Watson. I don't believe there's any true instance of general artificial intelligence that's out there, because there'd be no way to control that. Once that event happens, it will largely be out of our hands, and we'll know. It will be so significant of an event that I think we'll all know in one way, shape, or form. So from my definition, I don't think it's happened yet, but I do believe it's possible. I do believe it's possible within our lifetime, although I'm not entirely, that could be a whole nother branch we could talk about, but I'll pause there. I do believe it's possible. I don't believe it's happened yet. And there's no technology I've seen that's close to it.
That was perfect. That's you've hit it from multiple dimensions. So if we go back to just automation, and what's going on in the present moment, are there any other? We're always hearing about the fact that there's this convergence of multiple all these new technologies that are, each of which is revolutionary in its own right. And there's like 12 to 15 of them, and they're all kind of maturing at the same time. And that on top of it, they're like converging on top of each other, which is why, we're talking about both automation and AI. They're two separate things, but they're kind of being integrated in some way. Are there other technologies that are going to converge on this automation space? NLP might be one, for instance, natural language processing, that would be considered a separate technology. Okay. Are there any other technologies that are out there that are converging to make automation more powerful, more efficient, more effective that you're aware of?
So it's a broad category that would fall into that. And I do believe, yes, the answer is there's tons of technologies. Most technology coming out today in one way, shape, or form is in service of automation. And I'll explain. If you think about automation, again, as the ability to make decisions less complex, there's really two things you need to make decisions. You need structured data coming in one side, and then you need decision criteria so that the decision criteria can be run against that structured inputs so that an output can be created. And when you think about all the powerful technology we have tons of powerful technology. And like you mentioned, AI that helps us make more and more complex decisions faster. And then on the other side, we have tons of technology like Internet of Things and all of these new internet connected and internet enabled measurement devices that are on the structured input side. Because what we're talking about is, if I want to know if I need to have breakfast, bacon or eggs for breakfast, I not only have to have the criteria for, well, is it a preference thing? Is it a health thing? Is it just a taste? Is it an availability? I need to know what the criteria is, but then I need to know what's going on in my environment. What tools do I have available? What supplies? So it's the measurements that are taken in the environment where I think we're making leaps and bounds, because with the Internet of Things, we can measure physical reality better than we ever could. And I think there's a lot of technology exploding all around the world to measure physical activity, or what I call measure operating reality. And I think that's come a long way. Whereas we first had this explosion of, hey, we can do billions of calculations per second. So our decision calculating technology was becoming so much faster and more available and more efficient. But now we're moving more towards the structured data input side. And in that way, everything, Michael, is, going toward everything has a sensor on it, everything has a camera on it, everything can read language now. All that is just being structured into inputs. And once you have more input data, then you can run more calculations, you can run more decision algorithms, and then that side of the house can catch up to it. So if you're following my narrative, I think every technology that exists falls into either observing the physical world and structuring more input data, or kind of creating faster decision mechanisms. And those two combined are going to create increasingly powerful automation opportunities as the market evolves, I believe.
Oh, great answer. But what, if that's the case, and the way you've explained that, it's very comprehensively that automation, AI and IoT, and are going to consume the world. And if that's the case, what is this going to mean for the nature of work, the future of work? What jobs do you feel are the most vulnerable? What professions are the most vulnerable? You could theorize. I don't even think lawyers and necessarily doctors are safe from this, once you combine all of these things together. Do you have any thoughts about how this affects the workforce across all levels within the workforce, from truck drivers up to surgeons? What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are that no one is safe, as you mentioned, and we started to even get to the topic earlier. And I shouldn't even say no one is safe, like this is a bad thing. I do think there's no process that it remains protected from automation, from the way I was just describing it and the way you also summarized back to me. I think, like you said, doctors, lawyers, truck drivers, I think the industries that are most, like, I guess we could say at risk, but also just the most opportunity, are where the technologies, you're already seeing them and they already exist. Like you mentioned, self-driving cars. We've seen a bunch of surgeon robotics. We've seen a lot of digital services and legal services, financial services that's able to collect, structure, and make stable decisions. A lot of these processes are already being automated. And in fact, when you look at the medical industry, you look at the legal industry, some of the ones you mentioned, they're already under a lot of pressure to break down some of the old paradigms of how it was administered by people and it needed human eyesight. Between the modern law firm really sort of decomposing into legal services, and even healthcare is actually maybe even a bit stronger of a bastion, but kind of the same pressure, kind of decomposing itself into microservices that are more prone for automation. It's just better for everybody because the cost gets better. And those are the first thing to go. And then after that, like you said, as we get better at automating, so as we start automating the process of automating and we get even more expertise there, and like you said, we have more technology to bring in more data and structure more data, then there's really no limit, in my professional opinion, to where that could go. And in a way, it means that all work as we know it is subject to automation.
So then what does this mean for, if you were talking to a bunch of college kids that were worried about getting careers and establishing themselves over the next 10 years, what exactly would you tell them if you had if you had a child who was 1 year old or 2 years old and they were going to be growing into this world? What would you expect for them? Do you actually think that we're going to, where are the opportunities going to be? Or do you expect that we are going to have to see massive political and social change in order to deal with the fact that there's no more work? What are your thoughts about where the comparative advantages for humans relative to this technology?
So, few points there. I'll answer them because now it's so fun. These topics are so incredibly entertaining because they're so encompassing. So let me start with what I'd tell young people today. And this may be not what the answer people would want to hear in terms of what should I do for my career, but really what I would tell young people, and I do on an active basis, is find what you legitimately enjoy doing and nurture it and cultivate it. So instead of being career minded and trying to figure out what's the best occupation, where's the most opportunity, which industry is going to remain relatively untouched, by, let's say, robotics, automation. I would counsel people in the modern era to not think that way, because even if you could think about a stable career path by the beginning of college, like at the beginning of your college career, as an example of how fast things are iterating, even automation aside, the pace that business evolves and iterates is so much faster. The landscape will look different by the time you graduate. The job market will look different by the time you graduate. And for human beings who are always grasping for structure and for a future that they can envision and then strive toward, it's going to be a very scary time for a lot of people. So my advisement would be to, in the present moment, you need to cultivate what you have a passion or a legitimate interest for, not strive towards far-facing objectives, but is, do I enjoy reading? Do I enjoy research? Do I enjoy communicating? Look at what inspires you, that creates the most creative energy in you, and cultivate those skills and find where it leads you. Because, as you're alluding to, Michael, there could be a case where then I guess I'll segues to the next part. There are going to have to be major social, political, economic discussions and changes that are going to be had in our lifetime, is my professional opinion. I think a lot of people say, we've been automating since the Industrial Revolution, and there's a lot of jobs, when some jobs get, when some jobs get automated, it just leaves room for more creative endeavors. There's a limit to that. And the reason there's a limit to that is because there's a limit to the human physiology. As we create more and more opportunity and we create more abundance through leveraging automation, there's only so much that humans can contribute to, because we have a limited mind and we have limited physical faculties. So if there is a limit, we will eventually reach it, and there will come a time where we'll all be automated out of work. And then that social, political aspect, we're going to have to figure out, do we want to have a universal basic income? Do we want everyone to have, do we need no currency and everyone can just, the abundance can be distributed through self-directed networks? Does the central government even play a role in a completely decentralized, automated world? And that, those are the interesting dilemmas that I think are going to face our entire generation. But ultimately, what you can do to combat any sort of anxiety or fear you have about that world materializing is to know that there is no time wasted cultivating the things that interest you in the moment. And I think that's my sincere advisement to people.
So, when you say that, if I were to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like what you're suggesting is the cultivation of general competency areas that you have a legitimate interest in. So you spoke in general terms. You said, do you like doing research? You didn't say what exactly it was. Do you like reading? Do you like communicating? Do you like helping people, or whatever it may be? General competency areas, because and you didn't say this, but I think I'm inferring it, because there's a great danger in specialization. Would you say that? Especially I think for young people, because if you put your stake in the ground that you are going to specialize in a certain field or area, that industry might be completely transformed within 2 years, and the job that you're preparing for is gone. So don't prepare for jobs, build competencies build competencies, not skills to meet the requirements of specific jobs. I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Absolutely. Okay. That's probably a better way to say it than I said it. But yeah, the investment in capability versus the investment in the requirements for a particular outcome, like you mentioned, that's going to leave you the most flexibility. But then also the important part of aligning it with what comes naturally to you. I think with whatever you are in your life, whatever opportunities career-wise are available to you in that moment, you're going to be a stronger candidate and more likely to be aligned if you just focus, like you mentioned, on general capabilities that align to your interests. And like you said, am I the kind of person who likes research? It doesn't matter if it's chemical research, biological research. Am I the kind of person that likes to take in information, synthesize it, structure it, and summarize it to other people? Because if so, cultivate that. And then depending on what opportunities are waiting for you in whatever job market it is, when you're ready, then you'll be aligned to present yourself in a very authentic way to handle that work. But other than that, there's no 5-year plans anymore. There's no 10-year plans anymore. Even companies are moving away from sort of heavy strategic work in that way, because what's happened in the last 2 decades that everyone is still sort of orienting towards is everything is faster. The cycles are shorter. And that's only going to continue at that pacing until we reach, the limit of what we can comprehend.
I don't want to get sidetracked with this discussion of the economic, political, and social dimensions, because we could do a whole nother talk about that. And I'm particularly concerned about the alternate dystopian realities that could emerge. But we don't want to go down that path, because that'll open up a whole nother can of worms. But there was, I mean, I think Yuval Harari wrote that book Homo Deus, and it's which I would recommend to anybody interested in this. And one of the sort of frightening, hypotheses that he lays out in that book is that you're going to see a death of political liberalism, because if you think about it, if people don't need to work anymore, if the middle class doesn't have anything to provide, then they also lose their political power. And so there's a dark side to this too, but we're not going to get into that. We're going to be optimistic and positive about the future here. But I want to get back to the more technical, some of the more technical talk. So and there's a lot of people that are listening to this that are IT professionals, they could be managers, or they could actually be developers. And so how are actual developers creating these, there's a vast, as you said, there's a vast spectrum in terms of the low complexity automation, high complexity automation integrated with low complexity AI or high complexity AI. But within that universe, how are developers creating these AI automation solutions? How much of it is open source? How much of this stuff can be purchased like off the shelf, or how much of it can you get from the cloud directly in some way? How easy is it to implement this in your own company if you had an idea for something that could be automated, or are people primarily relying on partners that are highly specialized to do this work?
Mm-hmm. So on the coding front, there is a strong mix, we'll start there, of competencies in the marketplace that are pretty common to what you'd see in any other type of software production. There's a very healthy open source network of libraries and code bases that people are using in the automation and AI space around decision making, taking in data, business rules engines, and then there's a huge mix of proprietary technology that companies have created and already own, and they're willing to sell to you. So I'd say there's nothing unique about the automation or AI space from a software development perspective that's going to block people from having access to it. So you can if you have your own code shop, you're not going to have to start from scratch, certainly, depending on your application. But also, if you're a larger company and you want to purchase a partner, or you want to purchase, your own software and try to configure it yourself, all these options are available. From what I see out in the field, the most common solution right now is partnering with technologies and companies that already have these tools that they've created. They have experience implementing them effectively, and they can help companies walk through that journey. And as we go through, there are big and small options for that. So a lot of people, when they talk about automation or artificial intelligence, the new thing or maybe the new buzzword that I've, at least as I interpret it, is sort of low code automation or low code configuration. And what that is companies who are massive workflow engines, or they have various types of solutions, they basically offer their decision-making code to you, and they help you implement based on your workflow and your company's processes. And the low code part is that you don't have to be a software developer to use these technologies. Really what you're coding is business rules and the ability to basically represent your business in their software structure. And that's a way that the market's trying to make automation and that kind of robotics more widely available for people to implement in their businesses. So I'd say there's a ton of options there. There's definitely a lot going on. I'd say the biggest challenge is the process part. But before I get there, I don't know if that was in your question, so let me pause for a breath there.
No, go ahead. No, absolutely. Please continue.
I think the biggest, and now this is something that I've run into a lot. So anyone who's looking to get into doing automation work or bringing this into your business or trying to harness the power of artificial intelligence to make decisions at a lower cost, you want to be wary of this relationship that I talked about between pulling data from the environment as your raw inputs, and then having a machine or a robot or a program help you take those inputs and make the right decisions out of it. So where the market still has a big gap is the translation piece. So what data will I take from the physical environment? And what I mean by that is, let's say you just imagine an assembly line and people are making shoes. Hopefully easy one to latch onto. If I said, now I have technology to have a camera in there and then take data on what's going on in the room and structure it so that a software could read that data, there's infinite amounts of process data that can be extracted from that room, down to like the atomic level of who's doing what their temperature is, the speed of things moving, the cost of items. This is what the Internet of Things is bringing, and it's bringing so much data, big data sets, tetrabytes of data. I mean, we have more data that we can structure than we have any conception on how to use. And then on the other side, you have all these tools that people are selling you saying, you just tell us what you're doing. We can help you automate a bunch of stuff. We can get all this benefit, and you just use our tool. But be very wary, because that's the piece in the middle, translating what data is relevant that you need to pull from your physical environment to make good decisions with, to configure into these tools and use robots for. That's the part where everyone doesn't talk about it. And there's a huge opportunity there that the market is still trying to get their head around. And that's where consultants are playing right now, and people who are aware of the relationship we're talking about. But it's somebody with the ability to go in and say, okay, out of the trillion data points I could take out of this factory room where people are making shoes, how do I know that I need to pick the number of people? I need to do it at this detail level. I need a machine here calibrated at this level of detail to take this kind of data at this frequency. Those are the conversations that are difficult to navigate. And a software provider or a developer is not going to be able to tell you the answer to that. You have to know your own business.
Okay, so that's not something that a decision that you can outsource to a partner. You have to be able to have enough knowledge about your business to make those decisions yourself, is what you're suggesting.
So I'd say that's the piece that you could outsource, but you can't outsource it to a developer or like a vendor of automation software. That piece is typically outsourced to consultants right now. I do believe that companies can command that knowledge, but we have to have more education, kind of like the conversation we're having. You have to be aware of what that is. So if I'm the shoe factory owner that I say, I want to automate these processes, and I just hire a tool, or I buy a software, or I buy low code, automation software, it's not just going to be, you're going to turn it on and you're going to be able to configure it with no expertise. Somebody has to have that expertise to know, how do I translate operating reality into a relevant structured data set? And that's what's going to be going into the tool, because then you're combining structured data with decision-making power, and then automation can occur the right way. Most people today, whether it's the business that just is trial and error through their new software tools and automation tools, or consultants doing it, and they're doing it at various levels of competency, that's the part that everyone's struggling with on both sides of the fence.
If as a kind of closing question, if we want to kind of wrap up, if you're a manager or an executive and you think there may be, this is new to you, or you haven't, you're listening to this interview, and you think, well, man, wonder if there are opportunities in my business to sort of introduce automation. What are the types of, as a manager and executive, what are the types of questions that you need to ask yourself before going down this path about identifying opportunities, so identifying where the business value is? Is there any type of heuristic that would be applied for somebody at that level?
So there definitely are questions, and I'm wary in our final comments to fire off a bunch of things that may be used carelessly, but definitely there's certain work that leads itself to automation more than others, especially if you have if you know the decisions that are being made throughout your process. And when I talk about process, let's talk about your core operating process, the one that takes inputs and then provides goods or services to the marketplace. So if you understand the decision in your process, and you understand the data that it takes to do them, and they're the same decisions that are made on a highly recurring basis, the more on the spectrum you are of stable decisions, stable data, and high volume of the same thing happening over and over, you should be looking for automation, because the technology is out there for you, and the expertise is out there for you to take advantage of those opportunities.
What were those three things? Well, I'm sorry, what were those three things again? Stable.
So stable, or you could say structured input data that you need to make decisions, stable decision-making, that you know what decisions need to be made, and then the volume. So the higher the volume of those two things coming together in your business model, the higher the cost opportunity there is for automating in your business. Mm-hmm. If you have a highly ad hoc or custom business, so if you look, let's take it down to the other side of that spectrum. So if your business is, the data that comes in every day is very different, it's very variable, you have a set of experts who are using very nuanced judgment to make variable decisions, and the volume of those decisions is infrequent or erratic over time, those are the kind of businesses where you could have the best automation expert in the world, and it's going to be a slog to try to get those opportunities capitalized on. And so generally at an abstract level, that's kind of the dimensions you want to think about in terms of how stable and consistent your processes and the nature and the volume of your process. But then what I'd say to people who are looking to get in this work, before you even contemplate it, you may not think about your business in terms of decision making and how many decisions I make. The thing I tell every business owner is, write your process down first. If you're even thinking about automation, if that thought is in your head, or getting robotics, or trying to make good on those opportunities, The first thing you should do is sit down and write down the process on paper. That's the subject that you're even thinking about automating. And if you can write it down and you can share it with somebody and tell them, okay, this is how it goes step by step. This is where we, make a decision here. This is where we just do this activity. That's the first step in even having an educated conversation about whether automation is the right thing for you. And you'll be surprised. You may think you know your process, but writing it down can be extremely revelatory. So I almost leave that as a teaser. But I think mapping your process on paper is really the critical first step of communicating to yourself or anyone else whether automation is viable for you. Because if you can't explain it and you can't communicate it effectively, you're not going to be able to put it into software. You're not going to be able to teach a robot, and you're not going to be able to have anyone help you with it.
Sam, you are a wonderful communicator. This was a very helpful to me, and I'm sure to our audience. It was great having you here today to talk about this subject. I certainly hope we can have you come back to talk about other subjects and to provide your unique brand of lucidity and clarity to many complex subjects. I hope you enjoyed today's event, and hope we can see you back here in the future.
I would love to. Thanks again for having me. It was a wonderful time.
Thank you.